I'm Jason Brown, and I teach history at the University of Manitoba. In this video, I'm going to briefly describe, first, how an ethical code for economic actors was developed by academics in medieval universities, and second, how this code was transmitted to lay men and women in the marketplace, and particularly to merchants and bankers. Then I'm going to illustrate this process by taking St. Antoninus of Florence as a case study in the formation and propagation of a medieval ethical code for economic actors. I will be presenting research from my book, St. Antoninus of Florence on Trade, Merchants, and Workers, forthcoming from University of Toronto Press next year. So first, how an ethical code for economic actors was developed by academics in medieval universities. The first universities were founded around the year 1200 AD. The original core faculties were the faculties of arts, medicine, theology, and law. The pedagogical approach used in all faculties of these universities is usually described as the scholastic method. It was a method which focused on interpreting texts using the tools of logic and rhetoric, and on pursuing the truth through reasoned debate and argument. The foundations for the modern discipline of economics were laid in these medieval universities. Concepts central to modern economics were identified and refined in the university faculties of arts, theology, and law during the period from roughly the 12th to the 15th century, including concepts like the relative nature of value, the responsiveness of prices to the factors of supply and demand, the benefits of a division of labor, opportunity cost, and money as a commodity. However, the approach differed from that of modern economics because the motive was primarily ethical. Medieval professors discussed economic topics in order to determine how Christians ought to behave when they are engaged in economic activity. Scholastic academics created an ethical code for economic actors through interpreting three sets of ancient texts. The first is a set of texts from the Christian tradition: the Bible, the writings of the Church Fathers, and the sacred canons. Choice passages from this vast collection of sources were excerpted, compiled, and commented on by two writers of the 12th century, Peter Lombard and Gratian. The second set of texts are those of Roman law, especially Justinian's Digest and Code. Many principles from Roman law were incorporated into the church's legal system, the canon law. This was done both by popes in their official collections of canon law, the Liber Extra of 1234 AD and the Liber Sext of 1298, and by canon lawyers in their legal commentaries and summae, handbooks. The third set of texts, and the latest to appear on the medieval scene, are the works of Aristotle. The most important of these for economic analysis were Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Politics. Commentaries on these were produced by professors like St. Albert the Great, followed by synthetic works attempting to provide complete statements of Aristotelian philosophy and harmonize it with Christian theology. By far the most influential of these is the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. In their teaching and writing on these texts, scholastic academics developed an ethical framework for economic activity, which I will summarize around three key norms. The first norm is that there is to be no usury. Usury meant charging a price for a loan of money. Scholastics found in both the Bible and in Aristotle the principle that it is wrong to profit from the simple act of lending money. Lending money must be done gratis, with no expectation of profit. However, they made a distinction between sinful usury and legitimate interest. The term interest was created from the Latin phrase quod interest, that which is the difference. Interest meant compensation for a loss incurred by the lender because of the loan. The second norm is that there is to be no fraud. It is wrong to gain an advantage through deceiving or misleading a buyer or seller. Standard examples were using false weights and measures, watering down wine, or selling brass as gold. Scholastics also taught that hidden defects which affect the value or usefulness of a good must be revealed to the prospective buyer, or at least the price must be adjusted adequately to compensate for them. The third norm is that purchases and sales should always involve exchanges of equal value. Now, I should make clear that medieval scholastics described value and price as relative. Thomas Aquinas proposed that the price of a good is a function of both how useful it is to human beings and how abundant it is. Another 13th century theologian, Peter John Olivy, said that economic value arises from three factors: efficacy, desirability, and scarcity. Although they viewed value as relative and fluctuating, nevertheless, they considered the usual market price at any given time or place as the presumed just price. The usual market price shows what this good is worth at this time and in this place, and a Christian should not knowingly sell a good for a higher price than it is worth, or knowingly buy a good for less than it is worth. This is the medieval just price doctrine. I should add a final important norm, which is implicit in the just price doctrine. There should be no market manipulation. That is, in brief, how an ethical code for economic actors was developed by academics in medieval universities. But did this ivory tower ethical code have any relevance for merchants plying their trade in the fairs, markets, and ports of medieval commercial life? Well, in 1458, a merchant named Benedetto Cotruli published his Book of the Art of Trade. It is a manual on commercial practice and business administration. In this book, Cotruli writes, "To no man more than merchants is it necessary to know the canons, because merchants have to untangle many knotty problems in their profession." His phrase, "the canons," means the Christian moral teaching. And it is clear from the rest of his manual that he means both the ancient texts of the church's tradition and the learned writers who interpreted these texts. So, how then was this ethical code transmitted from the lecture chambers and debate halls of the university to the merchants? The single most important vehicle for the transmission of this Christian ethical code from the universities to the marketplaces was the pastoral activity of the Catholic clergy. The clergy were expected to preach the gospel, which included both religious and moral instruction, and to provide the sacraments. The sacrament which was central to pastoral care was the sacrament of confession. The ministry of hearing confessions and counseling penitents was one of the major ways priests imparted moral instruction. Now, the 13th century was not only the time of the creation of the first universities. It was also a time when the Catholic Church launched an immense effort to expand and improve the pastoral care provided by the clergy. The Fourth Lateran Council, held in the year 1215 under Pope Innocent III, decreed that every Christian who has reached the age of moral responsibility should confess their sins to their parish priest at least once a year. In addition, Lateran IV issued a decree on preparation of priests for their duties of pastoral care. It described pastoral care, or guiding souls, as a supreme art. In Latin, ars artium, literally the art of arts. And it mandated careful formation and education of prospective priests so that they may perform this ministry correctly. In the same decade as Lateran IV, a group of new religious orders was created called the Mendicants. The most well-known and influential of these orders were the Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, and the Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic. The members of these orders were called friars. They devoted their lives to ministry in the growing cities of Europe. Core to their mission were the ministries of preaching, providing religious instruction, and hearing confessions. To prepare friars for this mission, the new mendicant orders quickly set about creating an education system and a network of schools. They produced a voluminous literature devoted to explaining how to properly and fruitfully carry out these ministries. And this can be called pastoralia, the literature of pastoral care. This literature of pastoral care is an abundant source of evidence about the transmission of the scholastic ethical code from the universities to the common clergy, and from there to the wider Christian population. Pastoralia included different genres, several. Instructions on methods of preaching, model sermons, manuals on how to hear confessions, and treatises on moral issues, usually called cases of conscience by analogy with legal cases. Writers of pastoralia drew extensively on the academic literature which I discussed earlier, but they summarized and digested it to present its conclusions in a briefer and more accessible way. They usually smoothed out some of the complexity of the academic literature and reorganized the material so that it could be easily used for the practical needs of clergy engaged in ministry. For example, the key norms which I outlined were scattered about in all sorts of places in the academic literature of philosophy, theology, and canon law. But in pastoral works, these norms were usually presented together under a common heading. The literature of pastoral care thus bridged the gap between the learned academic writers and the common clergy, including parish priests and mendicant friars, who were usually not university educated. From this point, I'm going to talk about an author from the late Middle Ages who was extremely productive in all these genres of pastoral writing, Saint Antoninus of Florence. He will serve as our case study. Saint Antoninus, or Sant'Antonino to Italians, was a Florentine born in 1389, who joined the Dominican order and ended up becoming Archbishop of Florence from 1446 to 1459 when he died. He was renowned as a true pastor, wrote many sermons, handbooks on confession, and letters of spiritual direction in both Latin and Italian. His magnum opus is a work called simply his Summa. My book focuses on Antoninus's Summa. It's a vast work on pastoral care. Speaking therein about the pastoral duties of the clergy, Antoninus says, "No fewer souls in modern times are drawn to God through confession when done diligently than through preaching, as experience teaches." His Summa, Antoninus writes, is a collection in the tradition of the friars. He left the sublime theories of the learned professors in the library, but has collected what he judged to be apt as material for preaching, for hearing confessions, and counseling and instructing on moral issues. Antoninus recognized that in its original form, this material was not ideal for the practical use of the humbler clergy, and so he assembled and presented it in his own way. I'm going to outline 3 approaches which he used. The first approach is of synthesizing the teaching of many different academic authors who wrote between the 13th and 15th centuries. In relation to economic ethics, you'll recall that medieval academics in several different disciplines worked out a set of ethical norms through interpreting 3 sets of ancient texts. In Antoninus's Summa, under the rubrics of the vice of greed and on merchants and workers, Antoninus drew together material from widely scattered places in earlier authors' works to produce a synthesis of scholastic economic ethics. Other pastoral writers also produced syntheses of this ethical code, but Antoninus's is unusually comprehensive. It is found in part 2 of the Summa, title 1, chapter 16. Antoninus draws together material from the Bible, early Christian writers, medieval canon law, and theological writers, including Thomas Aquinas and Peter John Olivy. The starting premise is that in itself, commerce is not wrong. Commerce is neither good nor bad per se. It can be used for either good or bad ends. From there, Antoninus lays out a framework for morally upright commerce. So this is his first approach, synthesizing scholastic economic ethics. A second approach, which Antoninus takes, is adapting the material into a preachable form. A good example is chapter 2:117 in his Summa on fraudulent practices. Antoninus enumerates many different types of commercial fraud, focusing on those which he knew firsthand from Florence in his day. For example, he condemns the way employers sometimes reduce their workers' wages by paying them in kind instead of money, the custom of payment in truck. This was apparently common in Florence's largest economic sectors, the wool and silk industries. However, Antoninus does more than simply state the way merchants may defraud people. He also provides a model of effective preaching practice, showing rhetorical strategies which clergy can use to reach their Christian listeners and persuade them to act rightly, through fear of God's punishments, reverence for God's commands, and hope in God's promises. One of the most common preaching strategies is the use of biblical imagery. Two striking images from this chapter stand out. First, in the book of Revelation, chapter 13, the writer John describes a vision of the end times, and he sees a beast which will make everyone wear a mark on their forehead or right hand, and anyone who does not have the mark will be unable to buy or sell. Antoninus says this mark of the beast is fraud. No merchant in the vision could buy or sell without fraud. But it also says in Revelation that whoever wears this mark shall drink the wine of God's wrath. I have not heard this interpretation of the mark of the beast anywhere else. Another image Antoninus uses is from Psalm 51, the image of a scammer's tongue as a razor. Just as a barber sharpens his razor with an oil stone before he trims hair, so a scammer sharpens his tongue with the oil of flattery so that he can trim off some of your wealth. The third and final approach which Antoninus uses is to apply scholastic economic ethics to practical situations. He does this in chapter 384. He discusses 12 categories of worker and how they often do wrong in their work. He applies the key scholastic norms to each type of business. I will give only one example from this chapter, Antoninus's discussion of sales on credit, which were very common in the wool and silk industries. Antoninus writes, "Now this is commonly observed. Someone selling wool or cloth sells it for more when selling on credit than when selling for money counted out to him right then, or for cash in the vernacular, at a rate of 10%. Now, several popes had ruled on similar cases of credit sales, condemning the practice as usury. But Antoninus does not simply apply those precedents to this case. Instead, he cautions, we need to observe what can be determined to be the just price. He makes the overall argument that the customary higher price in credit sales of 10% or thereabouts is within the bounds of the just price. He proposes several considerations. The cash price can be regarded as a discounted price, which merchants are induced to accept because of their need for cash on hand to pay their employees. Also, a key criterion of usury is intention. Does the merchant sell on credit to make a greater profit? The merchants themselves say that they would sell their cloths much more willingly at a price of 45 or 46 for cash if they could sell all of it or the greater part in this way than for 50 on credit, because having the money in hand, they would immediately reinvest it in making cloths. The difference in price from selling any cloth for cash rather than on credit would be made up for by the increased amount of cloth manufactured, because they would make 100 cloths when they make 50 due to lacking the money which they have to wait for on a term of credit. All these put together, Antoninus says, even if no one of them in and of itself, seem to render tolerable this mode of selling on credit. Now, finally, the impact of pastoral teaching. Earlier, I quoted the merchant writer Benedetto Cotrulli in his book, The Art of Trade, saying in 1458 that merchants must know the canons. This was only 4 years after Antoninus finished writing his Summa. And Cotrulli indeed took up and restated the teaching of Antoninus and other pastoral writers in his Manual for Merchants. He expounds the key scholastic norms: no usury, no fraud, observe just prices. He cites Antoninus by name, specifically his discussion of sales on credit, which I just explained. And so here, then, we have a contemporary merchant writer embracing the ethical code created in medieval universities and transmitted in Antoninus's pastoral teaching. And let me also mention the Florentine banker Tommaso Spinelli. Spinelli was close with Archbishop Antoninus. In his will, he asked that Antoninus's letters be buried with him. In addition to giving liberally to the poor and to the church, in his business practice, he appears to have tried to follow Antoninus's teaching, though he did not always fully abide by it. There's an episode in his life which encapsulates both his desire to follow the ethical code propagated by Antoninus and his failure to fully do so. A theme which Antoninus returns to over and over again in his teaching in the Summa is the right end goal of commerce. He says that traders should pursue commerce motivated by a good, rational intention. Such good, rational motives would include providing for oneself, one's family, one's community, or the poor. Now, traders should not be greedy for limitless gain, but should be satisfied with moderate profits. Caffero tells us that Spinelli, the banker, was in Rome during the Jubilee of 1450 AD. And when one of Spinelli's employees boasted of the huge profits he was making by speculating in gold, Spinelli told him to stop immediately. Quote, "Gabriello, I don't have such great need nor such great desire to earn as you may think. It is enough that I preserve myself and don't go backwards. I don't want too much. Don't buy any more gold." Gabriello said that Spinelli repeated this to him many times. Spinelli's statement puts in mind Antoninus's teaching. However, when 8 days later Spinelli actually saw how large his employees' profits were, he could not resist their allure and resumed the gold trade. In sum, an ethical code for economic actors was developed by academics in medieval universities. This code was transmitted to merchants and bankers through the pastoral ministry of friars, priests, and bishops. Antoninus gives us a case study of how they communicated this code to lay people. The examples of Benedetto Cotrulli and Tommaso Spinelli show merchants and bankers actually taking up this teaching. Spinelli also shows, nevertheless, that they could find it difficult to live up to. Thanks for watching, and if you have questions or feedback, you can leave a comment below. I'll read them and I'll try to answer any questions.